everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Charlotte Ivers. I'm a columnist for the Sunday Times and I work at Times Radio. And welcome to this event. It is, of course, on levelling up employment rights in the 2020s Britain. And it's from Bright Blue in association with the TUC. Now, of course, you all know Bright Blue is an independent think tank and a pressure group for liberal conservatism. 7 major research themes are bountiful economy, clean environment, good lives, rewarding work, empowering governments, just institutions and connected communities. So a lot of those, I think, play into what we'll be talking about today. Obviously, we'll start with speeches from everyone on the panel, but then we'll open it up to questions from everyone in the room. If you're listening on the live stream, you can also ask a question. You can tweet using hashtag #BrightBlue and hashtag CPC21 and follow at @WeAreBrightBlue so it gets through, and we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. Some of the questions we'll be looking at today, we'll be looking at the extent to which low-paid and insecure jobs have contributed to regional inequalities in the UK. How can the government encourage better jobs, higher quality jobs as part of levelling up? And also the extent to which the government should prioritise quality of jobs over quantity of jobs during the economic recovery. Hopefully we'll also touch on the pandemic and how it has accelerated the previous trends we've seen in insecure work, and also look at trade union membership. Is it indicative of growing issues around employment rights? So 4 excellent speakers for you today. Martin McTague is the Policy and Advocacy Chairman at the Federation for Small Business. Katie Schmuecker is the Deputy Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Brian Shorthouse is, of course, the Founder and Chief Executive of Bright Blue. And Francis O'Grady is the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress. So without further ado, should we start with Martin?
Right, thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. I mean, it's inescapable, the impact of the pandemic. I mean, the level of debt that small businesses have incurred over the last 18 months has now become unmanageable for something like 40% of them. And it's not evenly spread across the economy. It is very concentrated in retail, leisure and hospitality sectors. And it's what is dispiriting is there's more to come. You know, you've got recently the end of furlough, you've got the VAT increases that a lot of leisure businesses are going to have to deal with. And then Christmas will be the crunch for many of them. Will they survive a poor Christmas? And many of them are so weakened by this whole process that they may not do. So the question then comes on to, well, has that got a sort of regional impact? And has that is that something you can trace to a levelling up agenda? And it's definitely true that low pay and insecure work is a problem, but it's very concentrated in certain sectors. I'm a low pay commissioner, and the evidence is inescapable. There's a lot of concentration in certain sectors, and if you then look at how that is spread around the country, it doesn't follow the conventional sort of red wall analysis. It is mostly in areas that have got a high responsibility or focus on hospitality. For example, the Southwest. You've got a lot of poor coastal towns that are affected by this. And you've also, and this doesn't fit into the red wall analysis, London is a big factor as well. You know, there's a hollowing out of a lot of retail and hospitality jobs in London. So what can we do about levelling up? Well, I think if you look at the way levelling up essentially or its impact is likely to be, or where the votes have come from for Conservatives over the last, or in 2019, it is small towns and rural areas. And what we've found is that the businesses in that area are pretty thin on the ground, and they've got poor access to accountants, universities, solicitors. So it's very important that government steps in with better business support. And that, I think, has got a lot more to say about what will have a direct impact on jobs in those areas. let's not forget 60% of all employees work for small businesses. And after the last recession, 80 to 90% of the jobs created after the recession came from small businesses. So, you know, we've got a vital part to play in bouncing back from this crisis. And that analysis seems to be shared now by an increasing number of Conservative MPs. I think the group of, if you want to call them Tory rebels, that associate themselves with the north of England is starting to increasingly look at that as an issue. So the question that I think was put in the paper was, is this a choice between quantity or quality? And I think that's a false dichotomy, because when I talk to small business owners, they only really look at the total wage bill and where that and how they can deal with that. The negative responses to that are things like reducing differentials, reducing hours. They are common. We see that all over the place. But a more positive response could be driven by government, and it could be them reducing national insurance contributions, which has had a dramatic impact on both the morale and the future employment prospects of small businesses. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Martin. So I'll now pass to Katie Schmecker, who is the Deputy Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Katie.
Thanks very much. Thinking about the slogan for this conference this week, you know, the sort of headline is "Build Back Better," and you know that is what we really need to see from this government. We need to be building back better with good jobs at the heart of our economic recovery. You know, we think it's really important that you know, to sort of touch on the subheading for conference, that the government get on with the job of signalling the kind of recovery that they want to see. And for us, that recovery has to be centred on good jobs that give people dignity and respect and treat them like human beings. Good jobs that give people stability and give people security. Good jobs that work around people's caring responsibilities and their health needs. You know, those are the sorts of jobs that can unleash potential. Those are the kinds of jobs that can enable people to be able to pursue opportunities and that provide a platform for people to be able to build a better life for themselves. But we're quite some way from that, really, at the moment. If you think about the quality of work and insecurity, we have some pockets of quite deep problems in this country. There are about 2.8 million people who are experiencing variable hours every week, and 2/3 of them also experience varying pay. Most of them, they're disproportionately likely to be low paid at that. And that has a huge impact on people's lives. You know, if you're treated like a number, or if you feel like you're just a cog in the machine, you're not treated like a human being at work, that really grinds people down. If you don't know from one week to the next how much and when you're going to be working, you don't know if your shift might get cancelled at the last minute or if it might get curtailed part the way through your shift at work, how are you meant to plan family life, and how are you meant to plan your budget? And if you're trying to manage a health condition or you're trying to raise a family, how can you do that if your employer doesn't recognise that you have a life outside of work because you are a human? And I sort of talk about feeling like being a human because when we talk to people who have experience of poor quality work, that is the main thing that they talk to us about. They tell us that they are made to, you know, they feel like they are just treated like a number or a cog in the machine. But I think, you know, addressing economic insecurity through good quality jobs has real economic and political gains. You know, there are 1 in 8 workers in this country who are experiencing poverty despite being in work. Employers can't expect to get the best from those employees who are stressed about making ends meet and keeping a roof over their heads. They're not going to be giving their best at work. If we increase the amount of security, it gives people a platform for taking risks and for taking up opportunities and moving on in their lives. And if we increase flexibility, it opens up a wider talent pool to employers because it makes jobs more possible for more people. It also helps with levelling up. I think I agree with the analysis that Martin's just given about the quality of work and security of work across the country. But I think the useful way to think about levelling up in relation to work is to think about levelling up between jobs. So how do we make more jobs good jobs? And that will bring tangible improvements to people's lives, and it can do so quite quickly if we get on with the job of doing it. And that requires the government to do something that it promised to do in 2019, which is to bring forward its employment bill. And to use that to signal a new settlement on good jobs that offer security, that offer flexibility, and that treat people with dignity and respect. So we would urge that employment bill contains new rights to notice of shifts, rights to compensation if your shift is cancelled or curtailed at the last minute. We think that people need greater security around their contracts so that their contract actually reflects the number of hours that they typically work. We also think that there should be a right to flexibility from day one of employment. And really importantly, there has to be rigorous enforcement of the standards, because otherwise we allow bad employers to undercut all the others who are doing what is expected of them. So I'm sure all of us in this room would agree that work should be a route out of poverty. But to achieve that, we need to get on with putting good jobs at the heart of our economic recovery, and that means bringing forward the employment bill in this parliamentary session and using it so that people can feel the tangible benefits of a good job.
Thank you, Katie. And now hand over to Ryan Shorthouse, who is the founder and chief exec of Bright Blue.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. I noticed there's a kind of theme around quality versus quantity. And as I can see some empty chairs, definitely my call is for quality. Quality of debate. So thinking about the quantity of jobs to begin with, for a long time the UK has had near full employment, and it hasn't really been a huge debate in terms of the levels of employment that we have and the need to really boost that. Obviously the pandemic has changed that quite substantially. We at Bright Blue did some analysis recently looking at the increase in the proportion of people claiming universal credit in different areas of the country. And what that would reflect is people who've lost their job, but also who have had reduced hours or pay and therefore needed to come onto UC. And the pattern that we found was, yes, in London, we saw big increases in the proportion claiming universal credit, which makes sense because London is obviously has high concentrations of hospitality and service industries, which have been obviously substantially severely impacted by the pandemic. But also we found those areas in so-called left behind areas, so coastal towns, former industrial areas, also seeing the biggest increases in UC claimants across the first year of the pandemic relative to other local authorities. So you can see that joblessness and reduced hours and wages have been particularly focused on London and also so-called left behind areas. So really we need to be focusing on there in terms of boosting employment levels. What is interesting is now, as a result of the pandemic, you are getting low levels of immigration, and that is creating lots of vacancies, as we're seeing, shortages in many sectors. And so, in a way, that helps with the government mission beyond Brexit, which is to sort of leave a high immigration, low wage economy and move away from that. So, in a way, Brexit plus the pandemic really is helping with that shift away from that model. The new health and social care levy, which has just been introduced, is obviously a new form of national insurance, hitting both employees and employers. I understand why the government has focused on that, on national insurance. To raise that level of funding, you really need to be looking at the three main taxes, whether that's income tax, national insurance or VAT. But by choosing national insurance, you are obviously disproportionately focusing on workers and working age population. And there is evidence that by by increasing payroll taxes, you do harm wage growth and job growth. So in my mind, they could have taken the pain away from that a little bit by lessening the rate of the health and social care levy, by widening it to different forms of income. So thinking about pensioner income and rental income, as well as dividend income, to make it fairer across different segments of the population. So that, I think, would have been fairer, but also have reduced the negative impact of increasing payroll taxes. The second thing I want to mention, away from quantity, is onto quality and progression in work. And of course, one big focus on that has been the wage floor and the gradual increase in that since the introduction of the National Minimum Wage Act, which the new Labour government brought in. The Tories were wrong to oppose that regulation. They thought it would harm job growth. It hasn't done that. But the reason, perhaps, why it hasn't done that is because that wage floor has often been set by the Low Pay Commission, which is an independent body which conservatively estimates what that wage floor should be. And I do worry sometimes that we have a lot of sort of politicking going on, which is how high can we announce that the wage floor should be? Let's make it £12 an hour, £15 an hour, without rooting it in evidence. And I think, if we're going to keep that political consensus on the minimum wage, we need to make sure that we set it at a conservative and a conservative rate, which is not going to harm job supply. So I do worry about some of the politicking, trying to increase the wage floor to a certain rate without basing it on substantial evidence. So it's important that the Low Pay Commission keeps control of that. The other thing, of course, is the enforcement of the minimum wage as well. The government has a naming and shaming policy where it lists different companies, which is quite right. But I do think the labour market, the Director of Labour Market Enforcement, which is a government job, obviously needs to focus much more on that. It was Matthew Taylor, who has now stepped down. The successor should really be focusing on that. And then the other thing about progression is obviously accumulating skills and educational attainment. And we do know in this country, particularly relative to other European countries, your education qualifications are strongly correlated with how you do in the labour market. Is particularly pronounced, and there's a big gap between graduates and non-graduates. So I am a little bit sceptical of the government's desire to kind of place a cap on the number of people going to university, or feeling that we shouldn't have an aspiration of 50%. I think we should be getting more people to university as possible, but university is not just about reading English literature. At Cambridge, there are all sorts of courses at university. About 40% of all university courses are vocational in nature, and I think that's really important. And if you look at different countries, boosting the graduation rate is very important there and is working. I think the government's lifelong learning entitlement, which will give everybody post-18 a pot of money to be able to take different skills and university courses, is a really good idea, something Bright Blue's been calling for, making sure that people have student finance, loan support, whatever point in their adult life for whatever course that they want to take. That's a really important thing to help people both upskill and reskill throughout their lives. The details are still being worked out by government. Two things we're really looking for. The first is that there's plentiful amount of money in that loan account, so it's not just covering an undergraduate and a little bit more, but there's enough for various different courses. The second is that there's a rule on your access to loan support at the moment, which is if you do an equivalent or lower qualification. For example, I've done BA in physics. 10 years later, I want to do a BA in nursing. I can't get student finance support for that because it's an equivalent qualification. I think that rule should be scrapped to give people more flexibility, and that's a really important thing that the government should be focusing on. The third issue I want to just quickly touch upon is around self-employment, which we're doing a lot of work at Bright Blue. Now, self-employment has been rising for the past few decades. It seems to be quite a structural trend. And many people go into self-employment, do so for very positive reasons. And the research we've done, people in low-income households who are self-employed generally go for positive reasons. They want more flexibility and control in their lives. And on the whole, they're very satisfied with their work. In fact, more satisfied than employees in low-income households, which is very interesting. However, I do think the government needs to keep a careful eye on bogus self-employment. And there is an issue, I think, where employers obviously get tax advantages from not putting people who should be on the payroll away from being so, and obviously don't have to pay pension contributions as well. And for the employee as well, particularly if they're younger, obviously their net pay might be improved from doing that, but in the long term they may not get the benefits that come from being an employee. So, the Uber ruling that we've seen recently, which said that drivers, I think, was a welcome move, that drivers should be not having the status that they were given under Uber. I think that's a welcome move in the right direction, because at the end of the day, there should be clarity, is that if you're consistently working for a business regularly, they're your only person that you're doing business with, then really you should be a worker at the very least, perhaps an employee, and so there's a lot of, I think there is an issue around bogus self-employment, which is fueled sometimes by the tax incentives for both employers and employees. And of course the health and social care levy that's now been introduced widens the gap even further in terms of the amount of tax on employment versus self-employment, and worsens those incentives. Finally, I might just say, because I'm conscious of time, a few things about in-work benefits. So the UK has quite a low replacement rate, so if you lose your job and you go onto benefits, the amount that's covered on average is a lot less than, say, in other countries. And I think this is a problem for the UK, both on equity grounds. Obviously, you lose a lot of your income and it's really, really tough, but also on efficiency grounds. And the UK has quite low productivity, and a lot of analysis now is seeming to suggest that in part that might be driven by people feeling that they need to get a job very quickly, which may not match their skills. So if the benefit system is so low and inadequate, I've got to get into work straight away. And you don't get the matching sometimes, particularly if you're someone with high educational qualifications and skills, you may not get the matching that is necessary, and that may obviously impact on productivity, on efficiency. So when people present this division between work and benefits, I think it's slightly misplaced. And the other thing, I think, on top of that is, of course, we know that a substantial proportion of people, over 40% now on UC, are in work. And I do think the cut to universal credit, which is coming by the end of this week, the £20 uplift, I think that's a mistake, both on equity and on efficiency grounds. And it is the biggest cut, just that one move, the biggest cut in working age benefits since the Second World War. So I'm really sceptical of that. Finally, just on flexible working, the kind of shift to home working that we've seen during the pandemic. In many ways, this is a welcome trend, particularly for people who have not done as well in the labour market. For example, disabled people, parents with children. Working from home gives that more flexibility. So that's very welcome. It seems to be the trend is that it's going to stay in part. There's going to be much more hybrid working in the office and at home. I think that's welcome. But I would also give a plug for office working. And there's a really good study, a randomized control trial from Stanford University, which shows that yes, it was based on Chinese call center workers. People who work from home generally have higher productivity and retention, but they're less likely to be promoted. And that makes sense. If you're not able to network with, learn from senior people in your office, it probably is harder to get promoted. So in my mind, you need the best of both worlds, that hybrid working of office and at home. So I think that's really important, and I hope that stays. The government has obviously a right to request flexible working, which includes working from home. That's now going to be a day one right rather than after 26 weeks, which is something we've been pushing for at Bright Blue and is very welcome. But I think the trend to home working also raises questions about the equipment people have, the space which people have to work in, and we're doing a project at Bright Blue looking at whether there's new rules and rights that are needed for people in that shift to home working. Because obviously not everybody has a lovely garden and brilliant internet connection, and we need to think about that if companies are going to be doing more home working. So a bit of a kind of ramble across different issues, but hopefully and will trigger some discussion.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I'll now hand over to Frances O'Grady, the General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress. Frances.
Charlotte, is it okay?
Oh, absolutely.
Stand up. So I am sorry about this. This is my training, is to stand up, but also I'm conscious this is a quality audience, but like all quality audiences, it's bunched towards the back to allow for the quick exit. So I'm more comfortable standing up. But I would just... I would like to start by thanking Ryan, actually, for all the work that you do, because I think the TUC and Bright Blue, we've had a dialogue going for many, many years that people aren't always aware of. And it kind of feels that during the pandemic, the rest of the world caught up. That, you know, the importance of that dialogue, even if you don't agree on everything, is really, really valuable. And I think we saw during the pandemic how the government, unions and business worked together in quite an extraordinary way. It felt like there was a stepping up at a time of national crisis when it was important to have everybody's voice in the room, and that actually we saw material benefits from that, from the furlough scheme, which was something that the trade union movement pushed for hard, that yes, we wanted support for businesses, we have an interest in businesses surviving, but we thought one of the best ways to do that was partly through workers' wage packets, that the something for something idea, that it wasn't just giving a blank check to the boardroom, it was actually protecting jobs and our skills base. In fact, we argued that it should be conditional on skills training as well, which maybe looking at some of the current shortages might have been wise, but also critically again on an area that maybe doesn't get a kind of fair hearing too often, health and safety. It just zoomed to the top of people's concerns. I remember personally going into a supermarket and looking at very, very anxious, stressed out faces of women mainly on the cash desks who were really scared. And that issue of health and safety in terms of keeping Britain running became really, really important. And I think we all learned the value of key workers' jobs. Let's be honest, for the first time, many of us learned just how much they were earning, how well they were treated or not, and how important they were to all of our lives, whether that was cleaners or shop workers, care workers, and obviously the NHS. They were all really important. I mean, Charlotte, I had the pleasure of reading your article in the Sunday Times today, which was kind of talking about all of these sorts of issues around former Red Wall seats, attitudes towards tax and trade, dividing people up, perhaps Conservative voters, according to whether they shop in Waitrose or Lidl, or possibly drink in Wetherspoons even, I think. But I think there is there's been a very interesting debate. Again, I will admit that I'm a bit confused by government messaging on Brexit not at all having an impact on some of the shortages and queues outside petrol stations that we're seeing. On the other hand, Brexit having a positive impact on driving up wages. I'm not quite sure which one it's supposed to be. But I guess what I wanted to do was just suggest that there's another dimension to this. It's not just as simple as supply and demand of labour. Actually, labour standards matter too. From a trade union perspective, we're now majority women in membership. We're growing. We've been growing for the last 4 years in a row, particularly during the pandemic, more people turning to trade unions. But we did a poll immediately after the last election about people's attitudes towards employment rights. And what was very clear that regardless of which way people voted, in fact, in former Red Wall areas, Conservative voters were even more likely to say employment rights mattered. And exactly what we've heard from other members of the panel, this mushrooming of insecure work, Nothing wrong with self-employment at all if it's chosen. However, we know there is very widespread abuse of self-employment status, partly because of tax issues, which I think the Chancellor is keen to maybe tighten up, but also because it strips workers of their rights. That Uber case was, of course, a union-backed case, and we had to go all the way to the highest court in the land to get a ruling that said that those people were really workers. You know, Uber couldn't just wash their hands of this. And if they were workers and had worker status, then that entitled them to things that are really important to all working people, not just the national minimum wage, which is pretty crucial, but also sick pay, holiday pay, and of course the right to be accompanied by a trade union. There are certain rights you only get from having that worker status identified. And when we talk about the HGV driver crisis, you know, I know that industry very well. We have seen systematic casualisation of that industry over many, many years, where many of those drivers who used to be directly employed are now agency contracts or self-employed. And I tell you, when it comes to, can I get money towards the truck stop, that means I don't have to go to the toilet on the edge of the lay-by. I can sleep somewhere safe in my cab, but at least be in a park that's safe. Those things really matter to people, and it doesn't shock me at all that we've got problems in recruitment, because people have not been treated as human beings. And that's not just about individual rights, it's not just about immigration. That is about a business model that's been built on transferring all the risk, including the cost of getting yourself trained and qualified for the license. All of that risk has been put onto the shoulders of those workers. So I think we have to deal with some of these deep-seated issues. And it's one of the reasons why we are so keen to see an employment bill brought forward. Now, I know there's been a lot of discussion, quite rightly, about working from home. But let's also be honest that this is a small number of the workforce who will ever be able to do all of their jobs from home. Some of them, for some of them it's great, for some of them we need those protections, including on how algorithms are used and how work is allocated and so on. Lots of new rights that we're going to have to think about. But there's also some really basic rights we need to think about, like the fact that not everybody during that pandemic got paid sick pay because they were so low paid they didn't qualify. Very often they were working 2 or 3 jobs, but because not one of them came up to the threshold, they were just no paid sick pay. I mean, I find it pretty shocking when care workers are in that position. A quarter of them on 0 hours contract, 70% of them earning less than £10 an hour. So, you know, there are many of these kind of basic areas where we have to get a grip. I would, you know, we say we'd like to see 0 hours contracts banned. What perhaps the more sophisticated policy point is we would like a right to guaranteed hours, just as we have on other working time rights, over a reference period. Let's be common sense and sensible about this. But no worker should be worrying week to week whether they're going to get any income at all. How can you bring up a family with that kind of uncertainty? So we would like a big focus on rights to security, a big focus on rights to a decent living wage, including for our key workers, who we reckon are owed some and more for what they did for the rest of us. And just finally, I would like to say that kind of as trade unionists, we know that rights aren't worth the paper they're written on unless you have strong enforcement. And that's why it does really matter how many health and safety inspectors we have, how many wages inspectors we have. But it also matters that we, in a democracy, that we have a strong and thriving trade union movement, because we are the people inside the workplace, on the ground, supporting workers, to get the rights that they are owed. And you look at employment tribunals. If somebody is a member of a union, their chances of getting a successful outcome much, much higher. But more importantly, on an everyday level, solving problems, avoiding conflict, coming up with sensible ways to make sure that all working people get the respect and the dignity that they are due. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. We're going to take some questions now. Just a reminder, if you are watching on the live stream, if you tweet us using hashtag #BrightBlue and hashtag CPC21 and follow @WeAreBrightBlue, then I will get to those. But we'll start with people in the room. When we come to you, if you could wait until the microphone gets you so people on the live stream can hear, and let us know your name and what organisation you're here with, that would be brilliant. So any questions? Yes, gentleman there with the check shirt.
Hello? Is it on? Working?
I think so.
Isn't the problem that we could have agreed with every single one of the panellists, and that slightly there's a contradiction between you? Because I agree that we need the trade unions. I don't understand why the people walked out when you started speaking. We absolutely need trade unions.
I'm sure it's just because I'm rubbish.
No,
it's nothing personal.
And we need small businesses to thrive, but they need the flexibility to survive. And so we want first-class public services, but we don't want to pay the tax for them. We've gotten ourselves at a crossroads. Brexit and the pandemic has put us there. Whether we like these two things, we don't like these two things, it's time now for this country to understand that if it wants something, it's got to be concentrated on exactly what it wants. We now know that we've been paying people too little wages, and we've been bringing in people to do jobs that we could have done ourselves. So I think that it's great that we sit and listen to the panel, but you're going to need to keep working with each other, and we're going to need to start developing a narrative that the public can understand. I mean, we might run out of turkeys this Christmas, but wouldn't it be better if the HG drivers did have better conditions and better pay? So we're going to need to work together, but we're going to have to stop this culture war that we've got going, because the culture war is getting in the way of progress.
Martin, do you want to start, and then I'll...
Yeah, I agree with you, and my work on low pay commission is an example where you do find a compromise. You do work with employee representatives to, and every one of the decisions of the low pay commission are completely unanimous. They have all been negotiated between the various interest groups. I mean, where I take issue with Francis' analysis is the reality is that in most small businesses, 60% of people work for small businesses. They are very rarely unionized. And that's not because there's a hostility to unions within SMEs, SME management. It's just that the employees are not interested. They're frankly not interested. And if you think 50% of employees work for companies with 10 or less employees, then it's like a sort of a large family. And for many people, they can resolve those issues quite well within that small group. But to come to the point that you said about where people are coming up with things like no notice, which Katie mentioned, and very poor attitudes to working hours, they're the kind of things that I think bad employers have got away with for years. They're not going to get away with it much longer, because now they're competing for people, and that has changed the whole attitude to that.
Francis, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I believe and hope that one area where we can achieve and certainly need a national consensus is a green industrial strategy to create jobs in the parts of the country that need them most. I'm a bit of an anorak on industrial policy, and skills has to be a key part of that. But what's very clear, all the international evidence, is that unless you achieve that national consensus, the chopping and changing means it just never happens. So again, that's a bit of a challenge to political parties as well as to unions and employers. But you know, it is an issue we're all talking about. I mean, again, for my part, I'd like to see a bit more Biden-esque ambition on that front, because the extent to which we are prepared to put our money where our mouth is as a country and invest will, I believe, yield dividends in the long term. But, you know, it's tough doing it up front, but we have to come together to sustain that. You know, you're talking about generational change, not just next year, but 5, 10, 20, 30 years in the same way other countries do. On kind of small businesses and unions, again, we've seen these huge changes in who employs who in the labour market, who owns businesses. We've seen that shift. You know, shares change hands much more quickly. That kind of commitment to the long-term success of a company, I'd like to see that enshrined in directors' duties and so on. But I think kind of an area where we have a shared interest is that we all know that sometimes the big guys at the top of the supply chain push that price all the way down. I've sat on the low pay commission in the past. I've heard strawberry farmers and low pay small businesses talk really passionately about how they want to do the right thing. They would love to pay a higher wage and treat people better, but the supermarket or whoever at the top, they just can't squeeze that money out of the contract. So we have to find ways in this country to push back together. It's one of the reasons we've argued for fair pay agreements across sectors, and not just this very basic national minimum wage, or rebranded as it's called living wage. You know, we need to find ways to stop the decent employer being undercut by the bad.
Katie, Ryan, do you have anything to add? Katie?
Yeah, I mean, just to start by agreeing very strongly with what Frances was just saying there. I mean, just to sort of bring it back to the level of the individual, JRF's been doing quite a bit of work recently with people who have experience of poor quality jobs, and those recommendations for the employment bill that I was talking about are ones that we have designed in collaboration with people who are at the sharp end of a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. And one of the people that we worked with whose experience has really stayed with me was a guy called James, who he worked in the supply chain for a major high street retailer. I won't name which one because he's asked that we don't. But, you know, a major household name. And he worked in one of the distribution warehouses, and his experience was appalling. It was, as distribution warehouses are, it's in the middle of nowhere. He was working night shifts, hours where he could get the last bus and get there, and then at the end of his shift, if he could get the first bus back home. Often, regularly, maybe not frequently, but certainly regularly, his shift would be cancelled at less than 24 hours notice, having already sorted out his childcare arrangements and potentially paid for a season ticket for the week, or his shift would be curtailed. And he would find himself on the middle of an industrial estate, in the middle of nowhere, having done 2 hours work, and it cost him 2 hours salary to get a taxi home. He might as well have not gone. In fact, he was worse off for having gone to work. And that simply is not right. And that is, you know, that is, as Frances said, that is a major player at the top of the supply chain, pushing that risk down, and ultimately that risk falling on the individual. And those are the sorts of things that we think need to be ironed out as we level up the quality of work in this country. I mean, I think in terms of going back to the question, though, of how we sort of come together around this issue, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, we need a bit of vision of what it is that we're trying to achieve here. And it's not just about, I think it's really important that we are talking about what quality of work gives to people. It gives people dignity. It gives them a platform from which they can take risks and opportunities. It gives them the ability to improve their lives for themselves and their families. All of those things are really important. But actually, at an economic, sort of bigger economic level, it is also, there are big prizes to be had in terms of, a sort of what often gets called in the sort of academic literature a high road economy of sort of higher pay and higher quality and better standards. and higher productivity ultimately, which Ryan was talking a bit about in his remarks, because we've done work at JRF looking at some of our productivity problems, and actually high reliance on temporary and insecure contracts, funnily enough, doesn't encourage employers to invest in their workforce. And actually, it doesn't encourage employees either to tackle some of the challenges that they might face at work, because it's easier just to move on and go and find another job somewhere else. So I think there are prizes to win here, and we need to have our focus on what it is that we're trying to achieve. And it is a more productive economy, certainly a greener economy, as Francis says, and one that actually delivers that quality of employment that means that people can make ends meet and can live sort of better, happier family lives as well.
Ryan, have you got?
It's fine. Do it.
Excellent. Any more questions then? Yes. Yes.
Hi, Ashley Calvin from The Independent. Just a very simple question, straightforward. Do you think it's possible for Boris Johnson to level up the country while simultaneously cutting universal credit?
Great question.
Should we go right to left? Ryan?
You mean ideologically or on the panel?
My rights too.
Okay. Do I think so? In short, no. I think it's a serious mistake. I think that a lot of the people who need and deserve universal credit are in so-called left-behind areas, and we're making a substantial cut to their income. The government, Rishi Sunak, is, I think, very sceptical of even introducing the uplift in the first place. I think is attracted to this kind of political dividing line between Conservatives standing for work and Labour standing for welfare. As I've said, we're nearing now half of UC claimants in work, and there is no evidence I've seen that the uplift in universal credit has damaged work incentives during the pandemic. In fact, vacancies have risen, employment starting to rise now as we come out the lockdown. It just isn't true that universal credit is acting as a disincentive to work. What it is doing is propping up the incomes of people on very modest incomes. And just a wider point about the welfare system and a kind of Tory vision of the world, which is, I know sometimes Conservatives can be sceptical of welfare, but in a free society and in a free economy, shit happens. People lose their jobs, relationships break down. The JRF, about a third of people every 8 years will fall into material poverty, under 60% of household income. Bad luck happens. I mean, the pandemic has taught us that it's not just about our agency and our will in how we do in life, but bad luck. Things happen to people. And as a result of that, if you want to sustain support for a free economy and a free society, and if you want to sustain participation in those things, a strong welfare system is needed. I don't think a strong welfare system is something which is polar to a free economy. I think it's necessary to keep the free economy going.
Just add as well, we've had a question from AJ in Peterborough, which might add to this. As somebody who was once on universal credit, he says, with friends still on that benefit, is it now time to reduce the taper rate from 63p to 55p as forecasted by IDS? So maybe something to touch on as well. Katie, do you want to add?
So just to respond to the question in the room, I mean, it's a simple question and it's a very simple answer. Yes, it's absolutely the wrong thing to do to cut universal credit. It flies in the face of levelling up to be taking £20 a week, that's more than £80 per month, £1,000 a year from those in our society who are the worst off. It simply does not make sense in terms of if your goal is levelling up and protecting those who are worst off in our society, which this government has also said it wants to do. And I think, again, think about the recovery, it takes money from, it sucks money out of those places that are struggling economically anyway, because those are the places that have more people on universal credit. Again, it just runs counter to the idea of levelling up. So cutting universal credit is absolutely the wrong thing to do. And I think what it actually shows, and in fact, the Chancellor himself talked about this when he introduced the increase in the first place. He talked about the need to strengthen our safety net. That says it all. our 10 years of cuts and freezes to Social Security had led us to a place where Social Security was not adequate, frankly. And the increase was really important, and it was the right thing to do then, and the right thing to do now is to keep it. Because nobody's bills are about to get £20 per week less. In fact, we know that the opposite is about to happen. So absolutely not the right thing to do. Coming on to the taper briefly, I think we would agree, actually, that reducing the taper is a good thing to do. But I think it doesn't get away from this fundamental point that I was just making about adequacy, which is, you have to have an adequate foundation from which to build, and then you think about the other things like work allowances and tapers within universal credit. We have to get the fundamental adequacy of the system right, and that's what the £20 increase helped us to move towards, and cutting it would be going back in the opposite direction, and it will be damaging and harmful to people because, as I said, no one's bills are about to get £20 per week cheaper.
Martin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think so. I think the best way I can answer it is, I think Ryan's point about welfare and work is sort of ideological divide. I think it's completely false, because we know from the work on Low Pay Commission that roughly 70% of the increase that you give the low paid gets clawed back through benefits. So they don't see the bulk of that of that increase. And there's been that sort of bizarre debate in the Labour conference about, is it going to be £10 or is it going to be £15? For many people, that's completely academic, because it'll all come off their benefit payments. And I think we have to recognise that at the bottom end of the employment scale, that it is a joint effort between government and employers to try and make sure those jobs are viable. And we can't duck that issue.
Frances?
Well, the answer is no, it's immoral. You only have to look at what's happening in terms of food bank use, family debt, child poverty, everybody getting ready for a disaster waiting to happen, with what's described as a £20 cut is actually a 20% cut. Try and think about that in terms of your income. If you're living week to week, where every penny counts, a 20% cut is really big. And as others have said, it's also economically wrong, because the one thing that you can depend on in terms of low paid people, the working poor, or those who are looking for a job, is that they spend their money in local shops and businesses, unlike those who are very, very wealthy who tend to hoard it. So given most economists agree that the biggest challenge we face currently is demand and sustaining demand, it will have a dire impact on the communities that can least afford to see that money sucked out. So it's never too late to think again. No shame in changing your mind. I really hope the government changes its mind on this one.
Yes, lady with the blonde hair at the back.
Hi, I'm Sophie, I work at Uber. Personal point though, I just want to reiterate what Frances said earlier about the importance of seeing a panel like this today and also agreeing across different political lines. I think it's super important, and I guess, really grateful to Bright Blue for bringing this together today, and actually for Frances' comments you made after the Chancellor's furlough scheme. I think it took a lot of people back that someone in the Trades Union Congress would be giving compliment to a Conservative Chancellor, but I think it just shows how important it is to try and maintain sort of credit where it's due, so thanks. From Uber, obviously a bit of a right of reply. Basically Uber is now offering worker status, so it was pension as well that we launched a couple of weeks ago for Uber drivers. I think for us, for the business, we'd always been looking for ways to provide flexibility or safeguard the flexibility whilst providing protections. And actually the law was quite unclear in that regard. Now there is clarity, and we're proud to be the only operator providing worker benefits. But that kind of leads on to my question, which is, we are the only operator providing worker benefits, yet the Supreme Court gave very clear, I was going to say clear clarity, but that is unnecessary, but it gave clarity that this should be offered with in the industry that we're in, and probably wider across the gig economy. So my question is, in terms of an employment bill being brought forward, which Francis, you mentioned, what are the panel's views on how an employment bill can be used to show or reflect things that have also gone on in the courts, and to provide a bit more certainty to businesses operating and looking after their employees?
Start with Francis then.
Yeah, and the first thing I want to say is absolutely credit to Uber for recognising a trade union. Our union, the GMB, that funded and took those court cases, is now sitting down with you and working out really sensible agreements, with all the sensible compromise and flexibility that you need in collective bargaining to work so that it works for the workforce and the business. And it's making a real difference to drivers' lives. So, in the end, that's what we all want. And I love the idea. And certainly go out everywhere saying, people can now order an Uber knowing that this is a decent employer. That is part of your brand because you have done what you've done. So, all credit to you. But I must agree that I do personally find this really frustrating that after all of that, it was Winston Churchill who talked about the importance of decent employers not being undercut by the bad. And we've still got a number of employers in the gig economy we have yet to convince. I'm sure we will, but it's taking time to convince to do what you did and do the decent thing. But also, we could speed that up with clarity in an employment bill. That would, I think, be in all of our interests, that we can, actually figure out, what worker status, reaffirm those court findings through an employment bill, I think would be really, really helpful. And there are new issues we have to deal with, algorithms frankly, with gender and race discrimination written in, we want to tackle those, and we've got to find new ways to do that. But I think much better that we can come together around a table and do it with government, unions and business, rather than have to fight it out in the courts.
Martin.
Yeah, I understand the debate between Uber and the TUC, but you can lose sight of the fact that virtually all self-employment is genuine, and it is people taking agency and wanting to be their own, have their own destiny in their own hands. So I think this debate can sometimes distort that. And when you look at the abuses, we are never going to defend the abuses of self-employment. People who compete unfairly by, using bogus self-employment to just cut national insurance contributions. But in the end, you don't see much of that in small businesses. It is focused in the really big corporates who abuse it on a massive scale. So I think that's where the concentration needs to be.
And Brian, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's great what Uber is doing now. I think that's fantastic and should be applauded. I think it is, there's many benefits to Uber in terms of, the kind of flexibility it offers. I hear a lot of my friends, female friends, say, in terms of safety after a night out, Uber is fantastic for that. So it's about keeping the benefits of all that, but making sure, obviously, there are the guarantees. And I think it's, you're proving now that you can run a successful business and have those guarantees. And I think that's really important, that, making sure that workers have the right rights and pay and conditions doesn't necessarily undermine, a very successful tech company, So I think that should be applauded. Just also, you mentioned the furlough scheme, and, the government has obviously made its decision on universal credit in terms of the cut, but the furlough scheme is a kind of social insurance model, basically, which is acknowledged that, this terrible thing happened, which was completely unforeseen, and therefore government needs to step in and protect the livelihoods and incomes and jobs of people who have been affected. And it's been a very unprecedented and successful scheme, and the government should be applauded for it. What I'd like to see now is, yes, the furlough scheme has come to an end, but can we maintain it in some form? Obviously not in its current form, because it's bloody expensive, and there is no kind of conditions or contribution attached to employers and employees. Perhaps, though, there should, because on the continent, you do have these income protection measures where employees contribute to a pot of money. So if a worker faces a difficult time in the future, they might be able to draw down from that pot of money, so they don't just rely on the basic universal credit. There's something above that, which is actually a bit like pensions, right? Because you all pay national insurance, you get your basic state pension, but on top of that, you've got the auto-enrolment system, which helps you in terms of your private pension cover. Maybe we should be thinking about that in terms of welfare as well, where we have, a generous and substantial universal floor, which is like the universal credit, but then on top of that, maybe there should be some income protection scheme, which I think will be particularly beneficial for people on slightly more middle and higher incomes if they do see their income drop substantially. So I'd actually like to see the Treasury look at how the furlough scheme, not in its current form but in an adapted form, can be continued to add to the armoury of our welfare state.
Any more questions from anyone in the room? Yes, down front, right from the microphone.
Thanks. George Crozier. I work for the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Ryan mentioned that I think nearly half of people on universal credit are in work. So thinking about that, I was just wondering if the panel think that the income support that we have in this country, which is universal credit primarily, works as it should in terms of supporting particularly people on volatile incomes, whether that's because of changing hours or because of something else. Particularly in relation to the self-employed who have volatile earnings very often. The minimum income floor has a negative impact, which means that, for example, you might earn £12,000 over the course of a year, but if that's concentrated in particular months because you've got big bills, employment, work bills in other months, you get less than you would do if it was spread evenly over the course of the year. Our low incomes tax reform group has suggested averaging of self-employed earnings for universal credit as a possibility. I wondered what the panel think of that, as well as the issue more broadly.
Katie, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point. The whole sort of purpose of universal credit is to sort of automatically adjust as people's earnings do, which in sort of as a principle and as a concept is a really good idea, because lots of people, as I was talking about at the beginning of my remarks, so lots of people do have varying earnings from sort of week to week and month to month. But I think what you're suggesting is absolutely right, which is that there are some real problems in the detail of how it actually works in practice. Certainly for the self-employed, I would agree with you. The sort of process of the way the minimum income floor works on a month-by-month basis rather than on an annual basis is a problem, because if you have a seasonal sort of job, then clearly you're going to have some months where you're earning much more than others, but that can actually have a really negative impact on people's incomes on the months where they're not earning so well. Whereas actually averaging that over the course of a year, which is sort of how it used to work, I think is arguably a better system. So I would definitely agree with you that that's something that should be looked at. And I think actually it's not just about the self-employed here. There is also a big issue for people who are employees, but whose earnings change month to month. So a lot of those people that we've been talking about a lot in this session, those who sort of don't quite know from one week to the next, one month to the next, what hours they're going to be working, how much they're going to be earning, and they're paid on a sort of hourly basis. Universal credit's sort of designed for people who are on monthly salaries, but actually that is not the experience of a lot of people who are claiming universal credit, and that is a pretty bad design flaw, to be honest, because it means for that sort of group of people who are in that situation, they can find their incomes, because universal credit's sort of kind of a month behind your actual earnings. You can have like sort of real feast and famine if you've got the kind of job that where your earnings changed quite a lot from one month to the next. So yes, there are some big sort of design challenges to sort out there. I think obviously sort of just kind of improving some of the basic adequacy of the system would help, but there are some more detailed things that also need to be done alongside that in terms of sort of thinking about things like assessment periods for people who are in employment and the way in which the minimum income floor works for those who are self-employed. But rather than get lost in the weeds of the workings of universal credit, I will leave it at that.
Martin, have you got anything?
Yeah, you won't be surprised to hear, George, I 100% agree with you. It's, I think this has been something we've been trying to persuade DWP of for many years. They have a complete blind spot when it comes to self-employment. I mean, they are very good at sorting out benefit issues for employees, but when it comes to self-employment, they really don't get it, and they struggle to deal with that concept. But I think you're right, averaging it out would be a significant benefit.
Francis?
The TUC has been campaigning for a long time on the 5-week wait issue, along with many others. That, you know, there does seem a bit of an irony in this day of technology that it seems to take longer nowadays to actually get money into the hands of people who really need it right now than it did in the old days. You know, how come? What's going on there? And similarly on self-employment, I guess one of the things I was so struck by when we were in discussions with the Chancellor and the Treasury about furlough, but also trying to argue for some support for the self-employed, was just how unfit for purpose our systems in HMRC were in even providing the data, you know, because there are genuine issues. It's got to be value for money. If we're using taxpayers' money, you want to feel confident it's going to those most in need in the right way. But actually some of the systems were so old and the data was so old, it was actually quite difficult to do the kinds of things we wanted to do to make sure that money was going to the right hands. I will just ever so quickly just slip in a concern about the taxation system more generally, which is, you know, when we talk about increasing national insurance contributions, I'm sure there are things that can be done with tapering, but I tell you what, there's something more fundamental here about hitting the low paid and young workers hardest when capital gains tax. You know, why should the private equity chiefs who seem to be taking over swathes of our industry and certainly many social care homes, why should they be paying a lower rate of tax than low-paid care workers? It doesn't feel right, and I think the public knows it.
Yeah, I mean, just on the minimum income floor, I mean, it's a very wonkish technocratic thing, but it is essentially a kind of maximum income. I mean, it's probably incorrectly named, but it's basically a maximum income cap on what the self-employed can get through their benefits. And as a result of it, it does mean that over a year, if the same income, if a self-employed person gets the same annual salary as an employee, but they've seen fluctuations, they can actually get less in benefits, and that does seem to be unfair. What we've called for at Bright Blue is, look, you know, not everybody is who is self-employed is a sort of wannabe Richard Branson who's going to turn their business into a massive global company. You know, a lot of people who are self-employed, they do it for lifestyle reasons. They don't want to create huge businesses. And as a result of that, you do get fluctuations in your pay. So at the moment, the government has a 12-month holiday on the minimum income floor to help you get along, get going with your self-employed, and then you're bound by the minimum income floor rules. What we would say is actually maybe there should be another 12 months on top of that, but that can fall at any point during your self-employment to acknowledge the fact that there are some difficult months. Sometimes work is very seasonal. The government has, during the pandemic, said beyond that initial 12 months, a work coach, who's what a universal credit claimant works with in terms of their benefits claim, can, in their discretion, say, as a result of the pandemic, will give you more months suspension from the minimum income floor. So there is the right of work coaches to do that for pandemic-related reasons. We think it should go beyond that and be a permanent thing.
Any more questions? Yes, gentleman there.
Hi there, thanks. It's Angelo Bassu, Chair of Leeds North West Conservative Association. First of all, just very briefly to say thank you to everyone on the panel for just a really, really good, collaborative, interesting conversation with no point scoring, which is lovely. We've looked at lots of things about, because going back to the topic of employment rights, and I try not to look at this too lawyerishly, even though I'm a lawyer. Are there things other than specific employment rights and laws and minimum wages and so on, other things that can be done as part of the levelling up agenda? So, I mean, I'm sort of inspired by this from the comments about the HGV drivers and about the conditions they work under. Not so much, in part, there's the conditions which mean that they don't get to use their brakes or that they're incentivized not to. But there's also, I think, a bigger infrastructure issue that actually those truck stops don't exist. And how do we go through the planning commission process to make more truck stops? Are there any other bits of levelling up infrastructure or other policies that panellists may think are worth looking at, sort of coming at it from a different angle? Thanks.
Martin, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that jumps out for me, and I'm in my remarks at the beginning, I said that businesses in those classic levelling up areas tend to be thinner on the ground, is broadband and mobile communications need to be a lot better in those areas. And there's been lack of investment in those areas. And that means those businesses are at a disadvantage. And if they want to try and get workforce into them at a location that hasn't got a bus route or isn't on a train line, that's also a big problem. So if you're going to deal with levelling up those economies, you have to deal with those fundamental infrastructure problems that really have held them back for a long time and continue to hold them back.
Francis, have you got anything on that?
I think I love that question, because I think very often I end up talking about wealth and income, but there's another whole dimension to this, which for me is about place, power and opportunity. And sometimes when we do talk about place, I often think about buses and I've spoken to apprentices who travel 40 miles to go in, and what a big difference it would make to get an apprenticeship with a prestigious firm if the transport links were better. So it's real life stuff like that. I think on power, it really matters who's in the room, who's invited into the room, and who gets listened to. Which is, and obviously I have an interest in terms of trade unions, but I would say, as I said before, on issues like women and race, that matters too. And then on opportunity, I'll be honest, I still think there's a lot of snobbery in this country, and it's quite tough to fight your way up, and people are held back. And I'd like to see us talking more honestly about that and what the practical policies are for getting rid of snobbery in Britain today.
Katie, have you got?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, we've already heard about some things that I think are really important around sort of infrastructure, and whether that's sort of physical infrastructure of kind of the digital stuff, or whether it's like local infrastructure of buses. Buses, I think, are so important. That is the sort of number one transport of, well, I was going to say choice, maybe it's not exactly choice, but the number one transport used by people on lower incomes. I think, so to add a few things, the Shared Prosperity Fund is one of those pieces of policy that some of us who have a niche interest in these things have been waiting for a very long time. So when we were in the European Union, there were regional funds that supported economic growth in lagging parts of the country. We've had the promise of a shared prosperity fund to replace that as we left the European Union. We are waiting for that prospectus. I think it's probably going to come with the Levelling Up white paper and spending review. That, I think, is going to be really important. That has to at least match, and actually, frankly, needs to be more ambitious than what went before it. There are lots of things that need to be improved upon, which can be improved upon. But I think fundamentally we would say that that is a pot of money that should be targeted to those places that are lagging in terms of employment and in terms of pay, so areas that have lower typical pay levels. And it needs to be a sort of flexible pot that local leaders can use in order to drive up economic performance in their local area. And in particular, actually, I think one of the big challenges in a lot of the places that we're talking about when we talk about levelling up is that actually the private sector is too small. We used to have this sort of annoying debate about, is the public sector too large in some parts of the country? Actually, the answer to that was always that that's not the problem, actually. It's that the private sector is too small. So what are the local conditions that need to be created to create the conditions for more private sector growth in those places, for the creation of more jobs? And obviously, I would say that they should, for the creation of good quality jobs. So how can we be sort of using the power of the state through its procurement and through its contracting and through what actually the state pays? The state is actually quite a large employer in some areas. But also, what is the business support? What is the investment? There's a sort of support to drive investment into these areas that can help to sort of grow the private sector. The other thing I would say is that skills is absolutely essential here. Ryan talked a bit about this in his opening remarks, so I won't dwell on it because I think what he said is absolutely right. We have to be really ambitious about how do we support people to retrain. Our labour market is continually changing. Technological change, we've got the sort of transition to net zero economy coming down the line as well. This is going to change the sorts of jobs that people do. People need the skills to be able to make that transition. We know from the sort of 80s and early 90s what happens when you have a big economic transition and you don't support people through it. We're still dealing with the consequences of that today. We need to not repeat that mistake, and we need to invest properly in supporting people through transition, and skills and training and retraining is going to be a really essential part of that.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And at the start of my presentation, I talked about how London and coastal and former industrial areas were most hit in terms of higher numbers of UC claimants during the pandemic. But London, as in previous recessions, is hit hard, but it bounces back quite quickly because the level of education and skills generally in the cohort tends to be higher. So you need to be very mindful of that. Just on the point around apprenticeships in universities, and obviously the government is keen to try and encourage more, or to raise the esteem of vocational and technical education, so people are more likely to choose that over the university route. What I would say is that the university model is a national, sometimes international market. So young people can choose to go anywhere in the country because they get their fees covered, obviously, but also they get their maintenance covered as well. And therefore, institutions are competing with one another on a national, sometimes international scale in the UK to try and attract students. Apprenticeships, apart from the very best companies, very localized markets, and the apprenticeship wage, the minimum wage, is a lot lower. And as such, you don't have people transitioning to different areas of the country to go and do apprenticeships. It's not common to do that. So there just isn't the national market in apprenticeships that there is in universities. So how can we do that? Because I think that will create more competition between different companies. And one idea we've had, for example, is to offer maintenance loans to people doing apprenticeships, not just universities, just to boost their living support. Because I think if you're really going to drive up standards in apprenticeships to make it a desirable path, at the moment there's some, Rolls-Royce is always the sort of gold standard of apprenticeships. But if you're really going to drive up standards and create a really good market in apprenticeship, it needs to be much more national, like universities. So one proposal is, as I've said, to try and do that. And then the second thing is just what Francis said about getting rid of snobbery, which I agree with completely. There's a book by Sam Friedman called The Class Ceiling, and it just looks at people from different social backgrounds, social economic backgrounds, i.e. what their parents' professional occupation was. And even if they got the same educational qualifications, went to the same university, the salary difference by the age of 35 or whatever is so substantial, which shows you that there is just a ceiling for people from different social class backgrounds. And why is that? Lack of mentors, lack of cultural capital, all of these sorts of things. And we really need to focus on that much more, because often the story about social mobility is very focused on the early part of a person's life. How do we improve their school? How do we get them to the best universities? But there's much more work to do even beyond that, and there's a big role for employers in making sure people from disadvantaged backgrounds are supported in work.
You could probably get away with one more quick question if anyone has got one. I want to take this one from the live stream then. I think it's probably mainly one for Francis, to be honest, but I'd be interested if anyone else has it. It's from Hannah B, and she says, with more working class people voting for the Conservatives, is there an opportunity for more dialogue between the party and the trade unions? And I guess I would sort of add to that, have you seen a difference in the way the government negotiates with you, speaks with you, since they got their big majority from voters they perhaps wouldn't have expected to get?
I'd say it's a mixed picture. You know, from my perspective, it's really important that the trade union movement gets a fair hearing from whichever government is in power. That's our job, is to represent the interests of working people. So, you know, clearly at the start of the pandemic in particular, we had a very strong relationship with the Treasury. I think we've had good access mostly across the piece. I was going to say mostly. But access and influence are two different things. And if I can just end up on an advert, the one part of British society where it doesn't matter what your background was, you can go all the way to the top, is the trade union movement. And I very much encourage everybody to join.
Excellent.
There is one thing I can add to that. I think my problem is the reverse of Francis's, is that the Conservative government tends to think we are a sort of wing of the Conservative Party, and I think they're taking us far too much for granted. There is a real sense of disappointment about that national insurance hike, and I think they need to be much more careful about how they treat small businesses.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to all the speakers as well, and to the TUC, who of course are partnering with Bright Blue for this event. Also need to tell you, you can sign up to become a member of Bright Blue, and if you do that before the end of the party conference, you can get it for just £10. And of course, you will all have your programmes as well on your chairs, which will give you an indicator of the other events that will be coming up from Bright Blue over the course of the conference. But have a lovely evening, and thank you so much for joining us, everyone.